I was 26 years old when I learned that some structures hold memories in their wood and stone, and that certain places refuse to let go of what happened within their walls. This is the truth I carry now, years after that winter night in the Wyoming territory. And it is a truth that has cost me every peaceful sleep I might have known since. The year was 1880. I worked as a territorial courier, carrying mail and messages between the scattered settlements that clung to existence across the wind-scoured plains of southern Wyoming. It was hard work, lonely work, the kind that aged a man before his time. I rode through weather that could kill, through territories where the Shoshone and Arapaho still held legitimate grievances, through country so empty that you could ride for 2 days without seeing another living soul. But the pay was decent, and I had no family waiting for me anywhere, so I took the routes other men refused. November of that year came early and cruel. The first snows arrived before Halloween, and by the middle of the month, the high country was already impassable. I was making a run from Rawlins to a mining camp called Prospect Hill, carrying correspondence and a payroll manifest that the company needed delivered before the month ended. The usual route took 3 days in good weather. In snow, it could take 5 or more. I made good time the first 2 days, pushing hard, changing horses at a relay station run by a Norwegian family who warned me that worse weather was coming. The father, a man named Erickson, looked at the sky with the practiced eye of someone who had survived too many prairie winters and shook his head slowly. He told me there was a storm building to the west, a bad one, and that I should consider staying put until it passed. But I had a schedule to keep and money to earn, so I thanked him for his concern, took a fresh horse, and rode out before dawn on the 3rd day. I should have listened to him. The storm hit just after noon, rolling in like a gray wall across the plains. Within an hour, I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The wind came from the north with a fury that felt personal, driving snow into every gap in my clothing, freezing my beard into a mask of ice. The horse struggled through drifts that grew deeper with every mile. By mid-afternoon, I knew I was in serious trouble. I had lost the trail completely, and the temperature was dropping fast. That was when I saw the cabin. It appeared through the snow like a dark smudge against the white, a small structure sitting alone in a shallow valley surrounded by bare cottonwoods. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. Shelter meant survival. I urged the horse toward it, my hands so numb I could barely hold the reins. The cabin was old, built from rough-cut logs that had weathered to a dark gray. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small covered porch sagged slightly to one side. There was no smoke from the chimney, no light in the single window, no sign of habitation. The snow around it was undisturbed except for my approach. I dismounted stiffly, tied the horse under the porch overhang where it would have some protection, and approached the door. It was not locked. In that country, in that time, locked doors were rare. A traveler in need had the right to seek shelter, and most homesteaders understood that refusing aid in winter was the same as murder. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, stamping snow from my boots. The interior was dark and cold, but it was out of the wind, and that alone was a blessing. I could make out the shapes of rough furniture, a table and chairs, a cast iron stove against the far wall. a ladder leading up to a small sleeping loft. I closed the door against the storm and stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. Something about the place felt wrong immediately, though I could not have articulated what it was. The air had a quality to it, a heaviness, as though the cabin had been sealed and forgotten for a long time. There was a smell too, faint but unpleasant, like old dampness and something else I could not identify. But I was half frozen and in no position to be particular. I needed warmth and rest, and this cabin would provide both. I found kindling and firewood stacked beside the stove, along with matches in a tin on the mantel. Within 20 minutes, I had a fire going, and the worst of the chill was beginning to leave my bones. I explored the cabin more thoroughly as warmth returned to my hands. There were signs of previous occupancy, a few tin plates on a shelf, a Bible on the table open to Psalms, a woman's shawl hanging from a peg by the door. But there was dust on everything, and the Bible's pages had curled with moisture and time. I wondered who had lived here and why they had left. The cabin was solid, well built, in a decent location, with water from a creek I had crossed just before arriving. It seemed wasteful to abandon such a place. But the frontier was full of abandoned homesteads, each with its own story of failure, death, disease, or simple defeat by the land's indifference. As darkness fell, I prepared a cold meal from my supplies and melted snow for water. The storm continued outside, the wind finding every crack and gap in the walls, making the whole structure creak and settle. I was exhausted from the hard ride and the battle with the cold. After eating, I climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, where I found a bare mattress tick stuffed with straw. It would do. I lay down fully clothed except for my boots, wrapped in my bedroll and coat, and watched the firelight flicker on the sloped ceiling above me. The loft was small, barely large enough for the mattress, with the peaked roof coming down at angles on both sides. The ceiling beams were rough-hewn logs, still showing the marks of the broad axe that had shaped them. That was when I noticed the scratches. They were on the underside of the roof beams, long gouges in the wood that caught the firelight. I studied them for a while, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They looked almost like claw marks, but they ran in the wrong direction, as though something had hung from the ceiling and scraped downward toward the floor. The pattern made no sense. Animals did not walk on ceilings. Nothing walked on ceilings. I told myself they were old damage, perhaps from some past repair work or from an animal in the rafters years ago. I was tired and cold, and my mind was playing tricks in the uncertain light. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. The footsteps began just after midnight. I woke to the sound of something walking directly above me on the pitched roof of the cabin. My first thought was that snow was sliding on the shingles, or that a branch had fallen from one of the cottonwoods. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It was footsteps, slow and measured, moving from one end of the roof to the other directly over my head. I lay perfectly still, listening. The steps moved with purpose, heel to toe, the gait of a person walking. They reached the end of the loft area, paused, then began walking back and forth, while I stared up at the dark beams above me and felt my heart hammering in my chest. After several minutes, the walking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. I waited, barely breathing, listening so hard that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing, just the wind and the settling of the house. I told myself it was the storm, or an animal, or exhaustion playing tricks on my senses. I had been through a hard day, and my mind was not reliable, but I did not close my eyes again for a long time. The next time it happened, I knew it was not on the roof. I was not sure of the hour, but the fire had burned down to coals, and the darkness was nearly complete. The footsteps started again, but this time they were inside, directly above me, on the ceiling of the loft itself, not on the roof, not in the attic space between the loft ceiling and the outer roof, but on the ceiling, on the underside of those sloped beams I had been staring at. It was impossible. I knew it was impossible, but I could hear them clearly, heavy footfalls moving across the angled ceiling as though it were a floor, defying every law of nature and reason. The sound moved from one end to the other, steady and unhurried, and I could feel the slight vibration of each step through the mattress beneath me. I was too terrified to move. I lay rigid under my blankets, staring upward into the darkness, listening to something walk where nothing should be able to walk. The steps moved back and forth, and I found myself tracking them with my eyes even though I could see nothing in the blackness. Whatever was making that sound was mere feet from my face, separated only by a few inches of wood. The walking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped again, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else, a soft sound, like fabric brushing against wood, directly above me, and then, very faintly, breathing, slow and labored, as though whatever was up there was resting after its strange exercise. I wanted to flee. Every instinct screamed at me to climb down that ladder and run out into the storm, to take my chances with the cold and the night rather than stay in that place another moment. But I could not move. My muscles would not obey. I lay frozen, listening to that impossible breathing, and prayed for dawn. When gray light finally began to seep through the cracks in the walls, the sounds had stopped. I waited until I was sure, then climbed down from the loft as quickly as my stiff limbs would allow. My hands shook as I rebuilt the fire. I needed light and warmth and something normal to anchor me to sanity. In the growing daylight, I examined the cabin more carefully. The scratches on the ceiling beams looked different now, more deliberate, almost like words or symbols worn away by time. I found more marks on the walls, long gouges that ran from ceiling to floor, as though something had slid down the vertical surfaces. On the floor near the stove, there were dark stains that I had not noticed the night before, old and faded, but unmistakably the color of dried blood. I found the letters in a drawer of the small table. They were written in a woman's hand on age-yellowed paper, dated from the spring of 1877, 3 years earlier. I should not have read them, but I needed to understand what had happened in that place. The letters were addressed to someone named Margaret, and they told a story that made my blood run cold in the warming cabin. The writer was a woman named Sarah Hendricks. She and her husband Thomas had claimed the land and built the cabin the previous year. They had been optimistic at first, but the isolation had proven harder than expected. Thomas had changed over that first winter, becoming withdrawn and strange, talking to himself, staring at the ceiling for hours. He had developed a peculiar habit of walking the perimeter of their small loft each night before bed, his boots heavy on the boards. The letters grew more desperate as they progressed. Thomas was no longer sleeping, Sarah wrote. He walked the loft all night, every night, circling the small space. When she begged him to stop, to come to bed, he told her he had to keep walking or something would get in. He would not explain what he meant. His eyes had taken on a fevered quality, and he had scratched symbols into the beams that he said were for protection. The final letter was nearly illegible, the handwriting shaky and rushed. Thomas had hanged himself from the main roof beam in the center of the cabin. Sarah had cut him down, but it was too late. She wrote that she could still hear him walking at night in the loft where he used to pace. But the sounds were wrong now, she wrote. The footsteps were on the ceiling instead of the floor, as though he was walking upside down, as though death had inverted everything he did in life. The letter ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into an ink-stained slash across the page. I left the cabin within the hour. The storm had passed, and though the going was difficult through the deep snow, I pushed on toward Prospect Hill without stopping. I delivered my mail and my messages and collected my pay, and I told no one what had happened in that cabin. Who would have believed me? But I made inquiries carefully, asking old-timers and settlers about the area where I had sheltered. An old prospector in a Rawlins saloon knew the place. He told me the Hendricks woman had been found 3 weeks after her husband's death, frozen solid in the snow 1/2 mile from the cabin. She had been walking in circles in the deep drifts, wearing only her nightdress. The man who found her said her bare feet were bloody, as though she had been walking for hours. The cabin stood empty after that, he said. No one would stay there. The few travelers who had tried to use it for shelter reported strange sounds, footsteps on the roof, and a feeling of overwhelming dread that drove them back out into whatever weather they were fleeing. Eventually, people just avoided that stretch of country altogether, taking longer routes to stay clear of the valley where the cabin sat. I never went back to southern Wyoming. I found work on different routes in different territories, and I never spoke of what I heard that night. But I think about it often, especially in the deep hours of winter nights when the wind rattles the shutters and old buildings settle and creak around me. I think about Thomas Hendricks, driven mad by isolation and something else, something that got into his head during that long winter. I think about him pacing that loft, trying to keep something at bay through the simple act of walking around and around until he could not walk anymore. And I think about what happens to a soul that is broken before death, whether it carries its madness into whatever comes after, whether it continues its desperate rituals in a world where up and down no longer have meaning. Most of all, I think about the moment just before dawn that night, when the breathing above me finally stopped, and I heard very clearly the creak of weight shifting on those ceiling beams. I think about the shadow that passed across the dim coals of the dying fire, a shadow that fell upward instead of down, moving slowly across the rafters before fading into nothing. I have not spent a night alone in an empty building since. When I must travel, I stay in populated towns, in boarding houses with other people around me, with voices and footsteps that follow the natural laws of the world, because I know now that there are places where those laws do not hold, where death does not bring peace, but only a continuation of whatever madness consumed the living. The cabin still stands, I suppose, in that small valley surrounded by cottonwoods. The door unlocked, the stove cold, the Bible open to its psalm of protection that protected no one, waiting for the next traveler who needs shelter from a storm, who does not know that some shelters are more dangerous than the cold. And above, on those ceiling beams scarred with desperate scratches, something still walks in the darkness, following a circuit it can never complete, searching for something it will never find. Some patterns once started cannot be broken. Some rituals once begun must continue forever, even after the one performing them has long since turned to dust. The frontier teaches many lessons, but the hardest lesson is this: some doors, even when standing open in a storm, should never be entered, and some roofs shelter things far worse than wind and weather.